Hey, everybody. Welcome to Daniel Davis Deep Dive, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. Is the Russian army starting to win the war? Everybody keeps talking about how we need to give Ukraine more weapons and ammunition and more funding and all this. And we want to make the war last for, all the way through 2024. Maybe in 2025, Ukraine can go back on the offensive. But what's not considered very much is, does Ukraine have the ability to even hold on, and might Russia win? Now, it hasn't been making much of the headlines here of late because of, so much focus on the Israeli-Hamas war. And then, of course, now all this bombing that the United States is doing in the Middle East. And we're going to touch on that here in a little bit. But for right now, I want to take a look at something that you might not be aware of, that there have been some breaches of the Ukrainian lines in the south. And Russia has been making some forward progress, and we're going to talk to you about, or we're going to show that to you. And then we're going to bring in Matthew Ho, one of the show's, our best analyst and best friend, to kind of help make sense of all this and kind of talk about what the implications of this stuff may be. And of course, you all know Matt. I mean, he's the associate director of the Eisenhower Media Network, former combat Marine, former State Department official, and just all around expert on, well, everything. Welcome to the show, Matt.
Thanks, Danny. Thanks for having me back on.
So I want to just kind of set the stage both for you and for our guest here, is that according to the Institute for the Study of War, which oftentimes I have some issues with, is how they interpret things. But one thing they're very good about is actually placing the accurate front lines here. And they have one of their notes from this morning's brief from yesterday's information as of yesterday. They said the Russian forces have made confirmed advances near Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and Marinka amid continued positional engagements along the entire front line. So just on that alone, you see that this is something that is across the whole 600-mile front line between the two parties, and that Russia is making some advancements. And really, I want to show you this issue about Avdiivka, because and Matt, I want to talk about this in a second, but I think that there's some parallels, some disturbing parallels from the Ukrainian side between this fight here in Bakhmut about a year ago, maybe a little bit more than a year ago, and how that ended up working out and how the tactics went. But first of all, I want to show people that, because they just may not be aware of how much movement has happened just in the last few days. So first of all, I want to show here a little clip of the Avdiivka fight by another friend of our show, Alex from History Legends. And I want you to pay attention to the part where he's talking here about how much territory as of January the 28th, so this was a little over a week ago, how much territory Russia had regained around Avdiivka at that time.
While Russian aviation is flattening the city, Russian assault squads are now storming Avdiivka proper from the north, the east, and the south. Here's everything they captured in the past days alone.
Now, on the 4th, actually it's actually today. Earlier today, the Military Summary Channel, which in my view is the best, most accurate, updated daily organization out there that tells people where the lines are, because they don't just use ISW maps. They also get from all kinds of sources in both Russia and in Ukraine, and they conglomerate and show us basically daily what's going on. Here's what they reported earlier today about Avdiivka.
So the situation for the Ukrainians on this direction is getting worse and worse. Now we are moving to the most important part, to the northern one. Most of the mappers have also updated their maps. We have 100% confirmed geolocations that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish control over this territory. We will adjust the map based on that geolocation. We haven't received any geolocation from this tree line, whether the Russians captured or not, or neither from this tree line, but it's logical, let's say, progress that if the Russians have control in this part and in this part, logically that Ukrainians either in this area are encircled or have already abandoned this territory. When talking to most of the mappers, they have updated their maps showing this territory. Even the deep state shows this territory under Russian control. So lots of let's say proofs, a lot of geolocations, reliable mappers, reliable resources confirms the Russian progress. So the area will be adjusted. Now we are moving to the central part of Avdiivka, because we got lots of updates from this to just one geolocation, two geolocations that we will discuss. First, let's start with Mappers. Mappers confirms the further Russian progress, and according to, let's say, Syriac map, as a result of offensive operation, the Russians managed to establish control over something like this. Let's say on the central part of Avdiivka, the Russian sources, let's say, not just Deep State also shows the progress of the Russians, and according to Deep State, the Russians managed to even move further to in the western direction of the chemical plant. So this is approximately the progress of the Russians according to the Deep State.
Now, one of the things I wanted to point out on that video was that in the previous one from the week, if you notice in fact, in just a second, I'm going to ask Gary to replay that first one again, because all of that area, you'll see a little lake in the bottom of that. So all that stuff that was just covered today, a week ago, Gary, just play the first part of that. Notice the area above the lake that was still in Ukraine control at the time of that video.
So the situation for the Ukrainians on this direction is getting worse and worse. Now we're moving to the most important part, to the northern one. Most of the mappers have...
While Russian aviation is flattening the city, Russian assault squads are now storming Avdiivka proper. From the north, the east, and the south. Here's everything they captured in the past days alone.
And so all that stuff you saw that was below his area that was still in the Ukrainian side is now in Russian control. Now, Gary, if you could also bring that map back up from ISW. So you see there that this is forming a cauldron, and already all that white space is where the Ukrainian side still has their troops in there. And it's starting to look mysteriously similar to the Bakhmut fight of last year, where a similar kind of situation developed, where the Ukrainian side was in this cauldron in a city and the Russians were moving around on the flanks of it. And Matt, I wonder if you can, what do you think about the similarities between Avdiivka and Bakhmut? And do you see anything that's going to have a different outcome for the Ukraine side?
Well, purely trying to be purely as objective as possible, I would hope that any competent military would learn from it, learn its lessons. And certainly the last stand, great stand, Alamo of Bakhmut last year was a catastrophe for the Ukrainians. It didn't even fulfill its political purpose or its media purpose of showing that, hashtag Bakhmut holds, right? This idea that's going to rally spirit all throughout the world, that's going to push for greater support for Ukraine, as well as, boost the morale of Ukrainians, boost the fighting spirit of the Ukrainian army. It didn't accomplish that. And if it did, it was completely, that type of effect was completely pulled out from underneath it by that horrifically stupid offensive the Ukrainians waged over the summer into last fall. So you see this possibility where the Ukrainians may do the same thing again, where for primarily political and media purposes, information operations, whatever you want to call them, morale purposes, they'll try to have some type of last stand, Bastogne Alamo type of event going on that rallies support. The thing about that, though, is even if that is successful, and say it was successful last year, which it wasn't, the losses that the Ukrainian army took defending Bakhmut to keep, or to try to keep out of the Russian hands a city that really did not have much military significance to it. There are some crossroads, and I believe those are rail link and things like that, but nothing that was going to change either operationally or strategically the course of the war. And I would say that's the same thing about Avdiivka. You could argue that, it gives credence to Russian claims that they're on the march. Certainly it would be nice for Vladimir Putin to have a victory like this before his elections in March. But, overall, it doesn't sway the operational or strategic course of this war. And the political course of it can only be hurt by suffering a loss, particularly if you take large amounts of casualties and waste a ton of munitions that you don't really have. So that, I want
to touch on such you just mentioned there a little ago. There was, and I remember, in December of 2022. So a little over a year ago, there was lots of calling. In fact, actually, Zaluzhny, the commanding general of Ukraine, actually went on record, or at least was reported on record, rather, as saying that he was against it holding Bakhmut at all costs. He wanted to abandon the city and reposition elsewhere, further back, to previously prepared defensive lines that would have been more advantageous to the defender and would have been harder to approach for the Russians. But he wanted to give that up. And Zelensky, for the reasons you mentioned, he said, nope, we're going to hold it. We're not going to give it up. We're going to hang on to it for all the reasons you just mentioned here. But they ended up losing it anyway. So they did lose it. They did move back, but they also lost a lot of troops in the meantime. Now, in terms of this current fight here, what do you think that they should do? And I want you to ask this from a couple of different directions. Just first of all, from strategically, what is in the best interest of the Ukraine? And then second, as a combat veteran, I wonder if you can talk to me about what you think it's going to have, what kind of impact it's going to have on the men that are being sent into Avdiivka to defend it when they already know what happened in Bakhmut a year earlier, and they see what's going on the ground now. How hard are they willing to fight, do you think, for this?
Yeah, well, I know, Dan, I know you feel this way too. It feel like a skunk at a picnic when we're with our, former military colleagues and talking about these things. And we always bring up that politics trumps everything. That's the most primary consideration. So, the decision to have a defense of Bakhmut or to not fall back, not to, to better positions, it's ultimately a political decision. And that's just the reality of warfare. And I know that's disappointing for a lot of people, but that's just the reality of it. So, I mean, so you have to understand, how can the Ukrainians explain this politically? Because those who are following this war, including reports from Western media, because this war is back on Western media, not as much as it was certainly before October, when the October 7th attacks happened and Israel's attacks on Gaza, but certainly it is getting mentioned again. And this particular campaign, this particular city is a city that's getting mentioned. So it has very significant political meaning in the moment. And I mean, you could swing this politically in the sense of, if I was President Zelensky, what I would say, would be basically, we are entering into a long form of warfare here, a multi-year war that we have warned about. And in order to prepare ourselves and put ourselves in a better position, we are pulling back to a greater defensive lines. We are using the terrain to our advantage. We are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So you can politically explain the military need to pull back. And I'm in agreement with you here. That's what the Ukrainians should be doing. They should be giving up these, while symbolically important, towns and villages and cities, ultimately don't have much strategic or even operational meaning to them. So pull back to a reinforced position, into a prepared defenses, and then utilize the things that we have seen in this war that have worked very well.
And look, I wish I had thought to get the graphic before we started on here, but they do have defended positions. They've been building them for quite a long time, and I believe it's about 16 kilometers further to the rear. They have lots of positions right now where they have, they brought in engineering assets and, building in, bunkers and all those kind of things. So they actually have those positions. So the question would be, why in God's name would you want to sit there and hold a city you're not going to hold? You're preparing. You've already prepared some defensive lines to go back further, when you can do it now and save those troops. And the double whammy to me is that all the things you just laid out there are so rational and so logical that the Ukrainian people would make sense to them. If the president said, hey, we're going to do this for all the reasons you just mentioned, people would go, oh, okay, as opposed to, oh, we lost another city. Because like Bakhmut, they're going to lose this city. So why lose the PR battle as well as the physical battle when you're going to move anyway? I don't get that.
I think some of that is that they are Western in their orientation, that they are very similar. In fact, for the last 30 years, they've received, the military and government of Ukraine has received media training from the United States, from Britain, from others, right? So everything is in the moment. Everything is within the 24-hour news cycle. Everything is short term. So those videos that Gary was just showing there, which are just horrific. I mean, it's nightmarish. Looks like something out of a film, right? The intent of that is to give a shot in the arm every day to the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian military. This is what we're fighting for. See what the invaders are doing. And they're hoping that people don't make the connection to, hey, it looks like this every day. It's been looking like this for 2 years. This is not going our way, and it's not going to go our way. Why don't we do something, different? If not, and so, yeah, this idea that to fall back, though, they're so afraid of doing that. Now, perhaps those prepared positions, those fortifications are not finalized. Possibly that's it. But the idea, though, that what we have seen work in this war so far has been landmines, drones, and then air defense systems. That should be how Ukraine should defend itself and go into a long form of this war. Hopefully that things catch up with Russia. Russia's economy is doing great right now, particularly relative to all the sanctions and all the expectations and the theories and the proclamations and predictions of those in the West. Russia's economy is doing great. But at some point, this war economy will catch up with it. And the same thing too, at some point, the conscription and the casualties will catch up with Russia. Every foreign war has a political cost, even if it's just across the border.
Well, they do, but I don't think that Ukraine can stay alive long enough to find out when they get to those lines.
Right. And that's where you look at what was the strategy here in Ukraine? What were they thinking? And again, the politics trumps everything, particularly the politics of the moment. And so, this defense of Bakhmut last year, people well know, it bled out the Ukrainian army. It bled through the Ukrainian army. I mean, they lost so many tens and tens of thousands wounded and killed in that fighting. Entire units destroyed.
The offensive never had a chance. I mean, there's so many reasons it didn't have a chance. But man, right. If you took it from like a 3% chance it had down to a 1% because you deprived yourself of tens of thousands of troops that could have fought it.
That's exactly right. I mean, that is exactly right. That's because then they roll into that offensive, which was, as you said, doomed to fail for a host of reasons. They didn't have, just doctrinally, whether you agree with the doctrine or not, the doctrine they were following, required them to have air support they didn't have. It required them to have long-range fires that they didn't have. Required them to have control of the electromagnetic spectrum, which they didn't have. Let alone, I was an engineer. They didn't have the breaching equipment. They simply just didn't have that. They were shooting the breaching equipment. They didn't even have what they needed to fill out units, let alone having the surplus of equipment that you're required to have, because you're putting equipment into the field to detonate mines. And so you're going to need a surplus just by the definition of what these things do. You're required to have a surplus. And they were going into it with a deficit in terms of,
so just hard to imagine.
It is. I mean, just on that, but then all the other reasons why the offensive wasn't going to work. I mean, just pushing head straight into prepared positions like that, the Surovikin line. I mean, they didn't even, supposedly they got past one part of the first line. I'm doubtful about that even, and then you had that interview from, I don't know if I forget who it was. I don't think it was General Syrskyi. I think it was another Ukrainian general, though, who talked about how within the first few days, or maybe actually, I think that what I'm thinking of is General Zaluzhny said this, that within the first few days, they threw out the Western plan and that they
it was Zaluzhny. It was.
It was Zaluzhny. They threw out this Western plan. I mean, they kept it up because we kept seeing videos of their equipment going out into these minefields and getting targeted and killed. But that you start seeing more of these, just basically squad level attacks. I thought maybe they were company level infantry attacks, but they weren't even company level.
They couldn't even do it because they couldn't survive in the field. And speaking of Zaluzhny, so he was the one that was arguing in December of 2022 not to hold Bakhmut, to pull back. He is also several months back said, don't repeat the same mistake in Avdiivka, pull back. And of course, Zelensky has overridden him every time. Now, as we actually had an analysis on last week where Zaluzhny wrote this piece in CNN, ironically, last week. And there's a lot of trouble with this. So I'm not saying that he's the next, iteration of George Patton or anything like that. He's definitely made some mistakes, but he's been right on some things here. But now, as you see on this Washington Post headline, apparently he's within days of being fired by Zelensky. So this is showing that not only are things going bad for Ukraine on the front lines, but they're also going back on the domestic side, because here you have the president, the commander in chief on the ground at odds and are fighting each other all the time. This has been going on for months. It's just now hit the Western press, but it's been happening for a long time. At the same time, you have Klitschko, who was the best ally, the mayor of Kiev, best ally of Zelensky at the beginning of this war. Zelensky's opening Arestovich, the guy, he was at the beginning, his official spokesman, who was many called the Goebbels because he was like propaganda left and right. Even he got tired of that. He now left and is potentially going to oppose Zelensky in a future presidential campaign, should they ever have one, because Zelensky has cut them off. So there's not going to have one now, but that's a separate issue. But everywhere you see, domestically, internationally, you see the U.S. Congress hasn't given any money that they were supposed to give back in September. The European Union is having a hard time breaking loose even a little bit of change because of a lot of divisions between the EU. There is no battlefield on or off the front lines that's going well for Ukraine right now.
Yeah, the EU did provide that money to Ukraine, which comes out to about 12.5 billion euros for 4 years, which is not a lot, but
that doesn't even cover their administrative costs, literally.
And that's what it's intended for, is to keep its government functioning, because the government accounts in Ukraine were supposed to go bare in a month or two's time. And then, but more importantly, what this money is supposed to do is prevent panic. Right? Prevent the idea that there is going to be a government collapse, that the economy is going to bottom out, that this house of cards is going to come falling down. So that's the idea behind this $12.5 billion per year. Is it's a lifeline. It keeps it afloat. It prevents that collapse from happening in April of, we can't pay our pensions anymore. We can't pay our government workers anymore. And then there's a run on the banks, and then, et cetera, et cetera. And there's also a cynicism behind it too, in the idea that, well, is this what will be used for collateral for Ukraine to receive funding, including loans from Wall Street going forward? I mean, if you go back a year or so, you'll recall that there's a big conference in Ukraine about, the reconstruction of Ukraine. And so that's the prize for many in the West right now, is not victory in this war, it's reconstruction in Ukraine, right? And so Wall Street is, very eager to get into this post-war setting, this phase 4 of the conflict, in order to be able to be the ones in charge of rebuilding and reconstructing, right? I mean, and we all know what that means. I mean, basically,
and by the way, speaking
it's just how dire this all is for Ukraine. No matter which way you look, it's terrible. It's terrible. Even if you take this lifeline of money, the implications of it are really negative as well.
So speaking of the money here, this is just another anguishing point. So we just laid out all the tactical, economic, and strategic reasons why Ukraine is not, they just can't win. And one of our listeners just put up on the screen there one of the comments that Russia is actually accumulating large number of forces, and their industrial capacity is really cranking into full speed. They're recruiting, not force mobilizing, large numbers of people. So their personnel is not in any risk in the foreseeable future of running up short, where the opposite has happened on the Ukraine side. All of that paints a picture in every way that the war is not going to be won by Ukraine, and they could actually lose. And with all of those facts, here's one of the premier voices in America talking about how we should actually give more cash for this.
Having already provided a very substantial amount, $44 billion is not trivial. It's very necessary. In my view, this is as right versus wrong as it gets. And we should have no question that if Russia succeeds there, that it won't stop there. Moldova will be the next in the crosshairs, or perhaps one of the Baltic states, or some others.
Virtually all of the security assistance that we provided to Ukraine, that gets invested right here in the United States. That's where it's spent. So in many ways, this is a win-win for us.
So I don't even know where to start with all those.
Yeah,
But
they were
you
all
see-
on
you
they were
see,
all on message yesterday.
at least
Danny.
he was honest right there on the last one with Blinken about, hey, it's work, which kind of gets to your point a second ago. But the Petraeus one, though, is the other thing is like that. Ignore all the reality that you see on the ground there, because my God, if we don't, Paris is going to fall with the Russians, even though they can't get past that little banana strip of land in 2 years. But somehow they're actually going to go all the way to Kiev, or all the way to the coast there,
Right.
the English coast, if we don't do something, which of course is insane. And I think that many people recognize it for the stupidity that it is, and yet those things seem to keep the way and sway. And we now, apparently the Senate is ready to give $60 billion to Ukraine with no strings attached.
Right. I mean, I'm waiting for for someone to say Putin's going to do what Hitler could not. He's going to cross the English Channel if we don't stand up to him. I mean, something just, but this is what they've been saying for decades. This is what we heard, of course, why we had to go fight in Iraq and Afghanistan. We don't fight them there. We'll have to fight them here. This is what was said, of course, during Vietnam. Right. I mean, I remember during the 1980s as a kid and a teenager hearing about how if we don't stand up to the communists in Central America, they're going to march up through Mexico and invade us. I mean, this is a tried and true defense of their warmongering that they feel works. But and certainly they're all on message. Chuck Schumer was saying the same exact thing yesterday when he was on the Sunday morning shows. So the deluging of the imperative of this, the fear mongering, the absolute necessity to do this, or else the consequences will be so severe they are going to. Right? I mean, so, but this is again is you can see. Getting back to say Zelensky and Zelensky and that palace drama that was occurring last week, which had been going on, as you said, Danny, for much longer than that. There's two consequences. One of the issues is Zelensky is reportedly more popular than Zelensky is. And that is that you can't have that at all. Not at all. I mean, you can't have that in a democracy, let alone whatever Ukraine is. And the other is what you're seeing, though, is the consequences of one bad decision piled upon another bad decision, right? The consequences of these short-term political decisions, right, that keep piling up. And then as that those consequences build, you have the inverse of possibilities, right? As you continue to make these really poor, really bad decisions based on political calculations, your opportunities, your avenues, your branches, the other things that you can do are limited, right? And so that's what you're seeing here, where the Ukrainians have backed themselves into a position where how do they get out of this? How do they get the best they can hope for? The best they can hope for is to and again, now you're getting into strategies of hope, which is what we've seen over and over again from American foreign policy decision makers for decades now. But these strategies of hope coming here in Ukraine, where the best they can hope for is that the Russian military is not competent enough to execute large scale operations that would take them through the remainder of the territory that Russia has annexed, let alone into those next four Western oblasts in particular, right? In particularly Kharkiv and Odessa. But that's the hope, is that the Russians are just not competent enough.
That is the problem. It is just a hope. I would like for this to happen. And so even though there's every reason to think that won't happen for the Ukraine side, that's what we're going to support. Well,
exactly. You're completely reactive. And I tend to agree with that. I don't think the Russians have the ability without a Ukrainian collapse to advance in like a big arrow operational maneuver, right? That would take Odessa or, et cetera. I don't think they have that.
I agree. But I think that the chances of a Ukraine collapse are actually higher than the Russians would somehow fall apart, or all those hopes would happen. And
that's exactly right.
That's the anguishing part to me, Matt, is that the bill payer for all this is those men that Gary was showing on the screen a few minutes ago, all these Ukrainian fighters that are still going to the front line. They're still obeying orders and going up. But they see that everything that they've tried, whether it's defensive Bakhmut, whether it's the offensive last year in the Zaporizhia area, or this one in Avdiivka, everywhere they see it's failing,
Right.
Any human is going at some point going to come to a point where they're saying, screw this. I'm not going to literally commit suicide. We're going to escape or just surrender or something. I just can't imagine they'll just go on forever.
Right. There are hundreds of thousands of fighting age Ukrainian men outside of Ukraine right now. I mean, there's a big deal made of it a couple of years ago when hundreds of thousands of Russian fighting age men fled. I mean, big, and the same happened in Ukraine. It wasn't as well pronounced. It kind of got lost in the noise of just all the millions of refugees they had. But hundreds of thousands of refugees were fighting age men in their 20s and 30s. And they're not going back. Why would you go back? Let alone like on another issue, again, the economic issue, the Ukrainian government says they need 4.5 million people to come back to their country to make up for their labor shortage. That's how big their labor shortage is.
That's
right?
not even frontline duty. That's just labor shortage so they can function as an economy.
That's right. And why would you go back? I mean, watching all this, why would you go back? Let alone, and now you see this political dysfunction. You see that it's just how ominous this is, how dark the future is for Ukraine,
right.
Where best case is that, which I think is the most likely case, but best case is that, well, I shouldn't say most likely case, but best case is that, you have this stagnated front line that because of the landmines and the drones, neither side can make significant advances through. And that's best case. And that's absolutely horrible that's the best case.
If that's the best case. Well, we're going to have to leave it there for the moment because we're sorry about that. We've run out of time here, but listen, folks, you're going to want to stick around because at, let's see, what is it? At 3:30, we're going to have a special show where we're going to look at what's going on in Israel, because you have Netanyahu has been very boisterous about telling America he's going to tell you no when he wants to, but he does want 17 billion of your dollars. And we're going to talk about, is Biden being bullied by Netanyahu? So you're not going to want to miss that. But even more so, folks, at 4 p.m., we're going to have a special presentation with Doug McGregor on a piece that he just wrote, whether we should or should not bomb Iran. And you are not going to want to miss that. Tune back in at 4 p.m. Eastern for that, and at 3:30 p.m. Eastern for the show on Netanyahu. You're going to want to see these both. But we really appreciate you guys. Ask you to like and subscribe. We remain unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you everything you need. Even when the major media is not showing you all the picture, we will, and you can count on us. And we will see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.